Great, everything is working, Roberto, so we can start whenever you'd like.
Yes, I think we can start. So start with a bit of an intro, so people that will join a bit later will miss the bulk of it. So welcome to everybody to this launch today. My name is Roberto Forin. I'm the acting and head of NMC Europe region. And I'll be introducing the session, the launch day, and then later facilitating the panel discussion. But as an introduction, I will start giving the floor to Jana Rostliberger, who is the program manager at the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, for a short introduction and welcome. So the floor is yours, Jana.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and sorry for the complicated pronunciation of my name. It's always a challenge. So thank you very much for having me, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. I would like to particularly thank colleagues from MNC for organizing this timely webinar on the 3 very interesting briefing papers that you developed together with UNODC and with the funding of the Swiss Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, amongst other donors. For Switzerland, counter-trafficking is a focus topic that is part and parcel of our efforts in the area of peace and human rights. We all agree that forced displacement internally or across borders heightens the risks of trafficking in persons. States therefore have the responsibility to prevent trafficking and to ensure effective protection of victims of trafficking or person at risk of trafficking. Normally at the Foreign Ministry, we support projects abroad and we focus on countries other than our own. However, when it comes to human trafficking or the risk of trafficking, we all know that this does not happen only in countries around us. It happens everywhere. It happens in our streets, it hides in the food we eat, in the products we buy, and in the services we consume. So therefore, when we were approached by the idea to conduct this study on the risks of human trafficking and smuggling of people fleeing from Ukraine towards Switzerland, it was clear for us that we want to support this endeavor. The initial findings of this study are quite promising, I think. The almost complete absence of smuggling from Ukraine to and within Europe at the height of the displacement crisis confirms the effectiveness of legal pathways. And of course, as a resident of Bern, I am particularly glad to learn and to read that more than 90% of the respondents never felt discriminated in my city upon arrival, and that they have really good relationship with locals and that they are satisfied living in Bern. From this, I conclude that we must have done something right in this case when initially welcoming people fleeing from Ukraine. I think it's very important that we learn from these lessons and apply them also to other refugees from other parts of the world. At the same time, I am aware that the challenges are not yet over. The study also clearly shows that only 2 in 10 people that were interviewed are in paid employment, and only 1 out of 10 have a regular job, while most likely their economies are slowly being used up. So this, in my view, remains a very fertile ground for potential exploitation or trafficking. So we must remain vigilant. I'm therefore excited to continue the cooperation with MMC and UNODC to further assess risks of trafficking 1 year into the war, and to make sure that policymakers and frontline responders remain vigilant in this sense. But first, of course, I'm very delighted to have a closer look at the 3 studies that were not only conducted in Bern, but also Berlin and Warsaw. And I'm excited to learn more during today's panel discussion And I all wish us a fruitful exchange. Many thanks.
Thanks, Jana, for this interesting introduction to the topic. So, yeah, literally just a few words, because the most interesting is to come, which is the research and the engagement to the panel. I mean, as you all know, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February, there has been a very high number of internally displaced people and people fleeing the country. The most recent numbers speak about more than 8 million of people fleeing Ukraine scattered all over Europe and further afield, including in North America. We know that, generally speaking, Ukrainian and people from Ukraine receive overall a warm welcome by hosting communities, and also on the policy side of things, as we all know, the activation of the temporary protection directive from 21, the first time that was actually activated in March 22, simplified the registration process across EU country for Ukrainians and also other non-EU nationals fleeing the conflict, granting them access to legal status, to services and rights, while preventing asylum services in Europe from being overwhelmed. So all sort of positive signals as Jana just mentioned. However, as the conflict continues and the risk of a protracted displacement crisis is there are sort of concern about the needs and vulnerability of people from Ukraine in Europe, and how these are going to develop over time. And while there is quite a lot of research, data is still scattered. Having said that, there is research on displacement of Ukraine in Europe. IOM presented just yesterday a study on this, and along many others. So at MMC, we have decided to conduct research, but with a very clear focus on few aspects that we think are where we can provide a bit of added value. So the first, we decided to focus on 3 cities, as opposed to do something more large scale. So the objective there is really to zoom in the specific situation in 3 cities. This we think that is interesting as an example, of course, cannot be extrapolated to the general population, but I think that provide interesting insight on 3 specific case studies that are relevant. And the 3 cities are Bern, Berlin, and Warsaw. So quite different, you know, one quite close to Ukraine, Warsaw, another one a bit further away, but a major destination for Ukrainian, Berlin, and then Bern a bit further away, and then a bit smaller in terms of number, but nevertheless very interesting also because of Switzerland having different legal system. Yeah. Then we decide, as Jana said, to focus on 2 sort of themes, if you like. One, a focus on vulnerability to traffic and exploitation, and a second one, a focus on movement intention, with a particular attention to return intention and triggers. So what we are presenting today does not focus specifically on traffic and exploitation, vulnerability to traffic and exploitation. Some part of what we are going to present today, of course, they are relevant for a conversation on vulnerability to traffic and exploitation, namely, as Jana said, the use of smugglers and the legal status of people at destination, and also access to services, access to work. So a lot of what we are going to present today is relevant. But if you like, we decided to keep aside for now analysis on vulnerability to traffic and exploitation and present it a bit later in a specific publication analysis. So today we are instead presenting the finding from the 3 briefing papers that we published in the last 10 days, which focus on journey, driver transpiration, relationship with host community, assistance and needs, livelihood and income, and long-term migration intention. So these 3 briefing papers are the result of data collection, qualitative and quantitative, which we conducted in the 3 cities in partnership with colleagues from the UNHCR Observatory on Migrant Smuggling, Claire Healy, the project manager of the observatory, is with us today as panelists. We were able to conduct these studies thanks to the support of Swiss Foreign Department of Foreign Affairs. Diana is with us today, and also with the support of the British FCDO, and with the support of the Bosch Foundation. And so we'd like to thank really the donors for having made this publication possible. Before moving to the presentation, just house rule, we have disabled the chat, so we'll be using the chat for providing you with information that are needed during the event. But we really would like you to ask questions through the question and answer chat box. Just put your question down anytime during the presentation, during the panel. We will take note of the question and then ask the panelists to respond. So thank you, and without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Maxime, our colleague from MMC Europe, who has been also in charge of the implementation of this project and of the has carried out himself the vast majority of the qualitative interviews, so very well placed to present us the key findings from the 3 briefing papers. Maxime, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Hello, everyone. Very pleased to see you today. So I'm Maxime Giraudet. I'm the FREMAI project manager for Europe at the Mixed Migration Center. Before starting, I would like to thank our colleagues from POMA Global, from Ipsos, and from the NGO USB, who were our data collection partners in the 3 cities and who did a great job. I know that some of them are with us today, and thanks a lot to them for their hard work on that project. I would also like to thank all the refugees, experts, researchers, NGO staff, caseworkers, or civil servants that accepted to talk to us and to contribute to that study. Before jumping to the findings, next slide, please. Before jumping to the findings, I would like to make a few points about the methodology and go a bit deeper into what Roberto told you already. So as you know, this is a mixed method research project involving a survey and qualitative interviews with key informants. We conducted 600 surveys in Bern, 600 surveys in Warsaw, 400 surveys in Berlin, and we conducted between 10 and 12 key informant interviews in each of those cities. The project also has some limitations, of course. First of all, the data we collected is only a picture at a point in time of dynamics that we know are currently extremely fluid in terms of humanitarian situation. Also, we followed a non-purposive sampling approach for the survey, which means that not all groups of refugees could be approached evenly. And finally, I would like to remind here that the project we conducted touched upon very sensitive questions and topics about livelihood, but also about human trafficking, which also has an impact on the findings as well. So I will present the 3 studies one after the other in order to keep coherence, also because I know that some of you are maybe interested in one city more than other ones, but we will try to draw comparisons as well and parallels as we go between those cities. Next slide. So starting with the study in Berlin in Germany, Of course, for the context, there were more than 1 million recorded refugees in Germany alone as of May 2023, making it the country hosting the largest community of refugees from Ukraine in Western Europe. A few words about the main characteristics of the respondents. 80% of the respondents we interviewed were Ukrainian nationals, but also 20% were third country nationals coming from a diversity of origins, either a neighboring country or Asia or Africa. The gender balance was slightly different between those two groups. 77% of Ukrainians and 43% of third country nationals were women. A large majority, Russian was the vernacular language among both Ukrainians and third country national, but also a minority of them spoke either English or German. A third of them spoke English, and around 15% of respondents spoke German among those interviewed in Berlin. Finally, a large majority, but not all the respondents who were residing in Berlin were under the Temporary Protection Directive, the Article 2024. I'm talking about 82% of respondents. And it's important to know that there was also a very significant proportion of third country nationals under that temporary protection, which accounts for the effectiveness of the provisions in the German law to protect third country nationals as well, in addition to Ukrainian nationals. Next slide. When it comes to their journey to Berlin, most respondents arrived in the first 2 months following the invasion, with a second uptick of arrivals between October and November 2022, which is what you can see on figure 1. This uptick can be explained by the approaching winter and the attacks on the Ukrainian electricity network at the time, which created fears about a very harsh winter. One of the main findings of the study, which Jana already touched upon in her introduction, is the fact that in Berlin, as in the 3 cities, smuggling is almost non-existent. Less than 2% of respondents reported that they had used a smuggler or had paid anyone to cross a border illegally, and the almost complete absence of smuggling suggests indeed that legal pathway, such as the temporary protection, have a very strong impact in reducing or preventing smuggling in general. Next slide. When it comes to drivers and aspirations, quite expectedly, 98% of respondents mentioned the war as the main reason to leave, with similar results between Ukrainians and third country nationals. Looking at the specific consequences of the war that forced people to flee Ukraine, fear of physical harm and death was the highest ranking sub reason for leaving the country, followed by the need for income and the loss of household property. Those were the 3 main drivers to leave Ukraine. And focusing on the reason for choosing Berlin among other cities, the need to be safe, as well as pre-existing social networks, are quite ranked as the highest reason for coming to Berlin. Gender, as you can see on figure 5, is an important dimension in this choice as well. And we can see that feeling safe and employment prospects are comparatively more important for women than for men. Just to side note here, as you will see, the numbering of the charts do not follow the presentation because we use the same numbering as in the reports in the studies, so you can easily refer to the different studies. Next slide. Looking at the relationship with the host communities and the accommodation situation, first, it's very important to note that 95% of respondents felt no discrimination at all in Berlin. Also, 89% of them reported a good or a very good relationship with the local population. But despite this perception by respondents, it's important also to know that some key informants reported anecdotal cases of discrimination against third country nationals, especially against the Roma community coming from Ukraine, but also students of African origin and especially in the early stage of the crisis, as the population, as massive influx of displaced people were coming to Berlin. If we look at figure 7 about housing conditions, we can see that those housing conditions are quite diverse and sometimes can be also quite precarious. Indeed, we see that more men than women and more third country nationals than Ukrainians are living in hostels in quite high proportions. This, I think, highlights a bit the fact that refugees from Ukraine seem to be suffering from pre-existing challenges in the Berlin housing market, and that more than 1 year after arriving in Berlin, many still struggle to find affordable and long-term housing options. Next slide. When it comes to needs and assistance, the most pressing needs of people who fled Ukraine were accommodation for 38% of them, employment for a third, and cash for 21% of them. The preeminence of accommodation as a pressing need echoes what we just said, which is that there are quite a lot, there are quite limited availability of sustainable housing options in the city. As you can see on the figure, not on that figure, but in addition to that, the need for psychological support seems to be particularly underappreciated by respondents. It is the least cited need from people coming from Ukraine when we ask them about their most pressing needs. However, talking with social workers closer to their situation, those social workers reported that the need in terms of psychology support is extremely high across all groups coming from Ukraine, although they note that there is a very strong prejudice against psychological support among the population of people coming from Ukraine. Now looking at figure 10 on your screen, we can also know that when they're looking for support, respondents mostly turn to their closer social circles in Berlin, and mostly friends, relatives, neighbors, and compatriots instead of authorities or NGOs and international organizations. There is, as we see, a very significant reliance on networks in Ukraine for Ukrainian, which shows the importance of pre-existing networks in information sharing. Next slide. Looking at livelihoods in Berlin, the majority of respondents is not working and rely on social benefits. And a small minority held regular jobs. We're talking about 6% of the population. Labor integration is a major concern for NGOs and public authorities. But 10% of third country nationals and 4% of Ukrainians reported engaging in casual, occasional work without a contract or working irregularly. According to employment authorities in Berlin, the right to work granted by the temporary protection has had a very significant impact in reducing the risks of Ukrainians to fall into severe forms of exploitation, as it was sometimes the case before the war for Ukrainians coming to Germany with no documentation. Finally, when asked about the main challenges about finding a job, it's very clear that the lack of skills in German language is by far the most significant challenges to find a job, as it was reported by 82% of respondents. Next slide. To conclude on Berlin, a few points about returns on future intentions. Intentions are almost evenly split between staying permanently, going back permanently, or not knowing among respondents. As you can see on that chart, gender also plays an important role, as the share of women willing to return permanently to Ukraine is almost twice as high as the share of men. Unsurprisingly as well, nationality is an important factor, and 18% of third country nationals are planning to go back permanently to Ukraine, while more of them wish to stay permanently in Germany compared to Ukrainians. Next slide. So that was it for Berlin. Of course, we had to go really fast. Now let's talk a bit more about Bern. Jana introduced some of the points, some of the findings in the report. Switzerland, I think, is quite a peculiar case because it's not part of the EU, and as a result, the Temporary Protection Directive does not apply. That said, status S implemented by the Swiss authorities provides a similar level of protection. As of April 2023, the Bern canton received the second highest number of refugees across Switzerland, which was almost 8,000 refugees. Now, if we look at the main characteristic of the respondents, we almost only interviewed Ukrainian nationals there. 80% were women, 20% were men. It was a slightly older population with 69% of respondents aged above 37. Of course, Ukrainian Russians are the most spoken language, but a good third of respondents also speak German, which is the main language used in Bern. Finally, all but one respondents had temporary protection status or another legal authorization to stay in Switzerland. Next slide. As displayed on that chart, and as it was the case for Berlin, most respondents arrived in Bern in the first weeks of the invasion. 62% arrived between March and April 2022. To fund their journey, almost 2/3 said that they either used their money and savings or received support from humanitarian organizations. Sorry, I wasn't here on my notes. 62% of respondents reported that they used their own money or savings to pay for the journey, whereas 33% relied on humanitarian organization to pay for the journey. And as for Berlin, the prevalence of respondents in Bern who paid for services to leave Ukraine illegally is very low. Next slide. When it comes to drivers and aspirations, unsurprisingly, the war was again the main reason to leave Ukraine. And same as in Berlin, the fear of physical harm or death is the highest ranking reason. But also there are quite interesting difference in terms of gender. Men cited conscription more often than women. Arguably, it's very low because only 7% of men cited conscription, which suggests that a significant number of men who we interviewed in Bern fits the exemption criteria set in the Ukrainian martial law, meaning that they are exempt from being drafted in Ukraine and don't really fear about conscription in general. When asked about why they choose Bern, social network played a very prominent role in how respondents made their choice. 21% reported that it was because it was recommended by other people, and 19% by family members who were living there, and 17% by friends living there. The activation of special protection mechanisms, such as the Temporary Protection Directive and Status S in Switzerland, may have opened an opportunity for Ukrainians to reach any European country of their choice, including Switzerland. And that's, I think, something quite interesting. And I want to point out to maybe further research on the fact that opening those legal pathways may also have an impact on decision-making for choosing specific destinations. Next slide. Looking at accommodation and relationship with the host communities, as in Bern, discrimination against people from Ukraine is very low. Most respondents reported that they had never felt discriminated in Bern, 92%. There were a few qualitative reports about difficulties faced by Ukrainians to find accommodations owing to the precarity of their situation, which qualifies a bit this very strong finding. And looking at regarding accommodation, 2/3 of respondents, 75% in total, were living in a house or an apartment for their family only. This is considerably higher than in both Berlin, where it was 30%, and Warsaw, where it was 41%. And it can be partially explained by the social support system in place in Bern, which is quite different. Social benefits provided to people from Ukraine are most of the time sufficient for beneficiaries to rent accommodations that would meet social standards. Of course, this explanation and this finding is very specific to the city of Bern, because in every canton in Switzerland, housing experience and social rules differ greatly, meaning that it might not be the same situation. Next slide. On assistance and needs, respondents received a wide range of assistance from the Swiss authorities. Only 4% did not receive anything, including healthcare, language lessons, employment, education, support for administrative processes, and transportation. Slightly less respondents, 65%, reported receiving assistance from NGOs, the civil society, or the Ukrainian community in Bern. But the fact that still more than 2/3 of respondents received also an assistance from NGOs and the civil society highlights the complementarity between authorities and NGOs in providing those support services. And despite the quite large support coverage from all those organizations, authorities and NGO and civil society organizations alike, who are involved in the response, the needs, it's important to note that the needs remain quite high across all respondents, with half of respondents who reported that employment still is the most pressing needs they have, which I anticipate on the next slide is quite interesting because the employment rate is quite low in Bern. Next slide. In terms of livelihoods, as I was just saying, the number of respondents with the paid employment is low. It's less than 20% of respondents who had paid employment, with only 10% having a regular paid job. This is consistent with official numbers, but it's also a low figure considering 82%, considering that 82% of respondents had an income in Ukraine before coming to Switzerland. This can also be qualified a bit by the fact that some respondents do not look for paid work because they take care of their home and children. It's the case for instance, 11% of respondents, which nearly all of them were women. And it's important to note for the context that there might also be a delayed effect on access to the labor market, as it was shown in some previous research by the OECD, which noted that employment rate amongst refugees from Ukraine has increased over time in Switzerland. If we look at figure 14, the results suggest that respondents had to be quite flexible to find work, and that some of them had to change their usual sector of work. It's especially true for women. When we look at the data, 3% of the women who interviewed used to work in the cleaning and domestic sector in Ukraine. And as I can see here, 30% are now working that sector in Bern. It's similar for the hospitality sector, where only 2% of them, 2% of women were working in that sector before, and here, sorry, it's 20%. Sorry, it's written restaurant catering. It should be hospitality. We will change that in the report. Finally, even though a third of respondents reported that they spoke German, the lack of skills in the local language was by far the most cited challenge by the respondents, 79% of respondents. Next slide. Very quickly, because I'm a bit late on return on future intentions. In Bern, a large majority of respondents, 77%, had not been back to Ukraine since the war began. Among those, 78% went back only one time, and the main reason for going back there was to visit family or friends or for administrative reasons. Respondents had varying plans concerning what they would like to do with their plans for the future. As in Bern, preference split almost evenly between planning to return permanently to Ukraine, planning to stay permanently, or not knowing. As you can see, moving elsewhere in another country is not so much an option for respondents. Next slide. We're finally getting to our final city, Warsaw. It's, of course, a very important city for that research, as it's the second most important host country for people fleeing Ukraine in the European Union, as according to the UNHCR data. And also because it's the main interface between Europe and the European Union since the beginning of the crisis for displaced people from Ukraine. Again, a few points about the main characteristics of the respondents. We, in the same proportion than in Berlin, we interviewed 84% of Ukrainians, but also 16% of third country nationals. Almost all of them are Belarusians. As there is also a shift in the gender balance, as 81% of Ukrainians and only 45% of third country nationals were women. Again, Russian and Ukrainian are the most spoken language, but it's important to note that third country nationals spoke languages useful for adapting to their new life outside of Ukraine or in Poland. Most of them, I mean, more third country nationals than Ukrainian spoke English and Polish. And finally, 70% of respondents had the temporary protection status, but again, important to note that third country nationals were in general in more precarious situation, as much less of them were protected by the temporary protection, and many more were in the process of obtaining a visa, 22% of them. Next slide. Looking at their journey to Poland, it's not going to be a surprise to you, as in the two other cities, the majority of respondents left the country at the beginning of the crisis and arrived in Poland between February and the end of March 2022. And similarly, the prevalence of people who paid for smugglers to go to Europe is almost non-existent, which looking at the three cities supports further the idea that legal pathways has very direct impact on the demand for smuggling services. And I think it's also important to note that third country nationals, I mean, if you look at figure 5 here, you will see that there are still 8% of Ukrainians who reported paying to receive transportation or documents to cross the border illegally, which is slightly higher than in the two other cities. And that third country nationals use those services much less than Ukrainians. This can be explained by the absence of restriction on third country nationals leaving the country compared to Ukrainians who are under the Ukrainian martial law. Next slide. Looking at drivers, war again, and especially fear of physical harm are the main reasons for respondents to leave Ukraine in similar proportion compared to Bern. And reasons for choosing Warsaw as the destination mirror the reasons for leaving Ukraine in the first place. For instance, feeling safe is the main reason reported by 45% of respondents. And as you can see, quite in similar proportions between Ukrainians and not Ukrainians. And it's followed by income and livelihood opportunities. As you see on that figure as well, in smaller proportions, social networks and pre-existing relationships also play a huge role for some people. 23% reported that they choose Warsaw because it was recommended. 18% by friends and 8% by family. As you can see from the light blue lines, this point is even more true for TCNs who relied quite a lot on their social networks to decide to come to Warsaw. Next slide. Looking at the relationship with host communities, discrimination in Warsaw is very low, but slightly higher than in Bern and Berlin. Indeed, 2/3 of respondents had never felt any discrimination, while 23% reported feeling discriminated rarely and 80% sometimes. The feelings of discrimination seems to be slightly higher for third country nationals, as only 57% of them say they never feel discriminated versus 69% of Ukrainians. And among those who reported discrimination, nationality and migration status were largely reported as the most common reasons, although you can see some small differences between Ukrainians and TCNs, third country nationals in that regard. Next slide. On assistance and needs, the majority of respondents received a wide range of assistance from authorities and NGOs and the civil society. Although the types of assistance varied quite a bit between those two groups of service of assistance provider. For NGOs, NGOs had a bigger role in the provision of language lessons and support for regularization of status, whereas authorities had a more prominent role in healthcare, access to transportation, and education. This is quite interesting because it shows the great complementarity of those two systems in providing complementary services for respondents. As in all cities, needs remain quite high across the entire population, and the most pressing ones are cash, employment, and accommodation. When in need of support, finally, again, respondents turn in majority to their social networks and their families. Next slide. On livelihoods, more than a quarter of respondents do not earn any money, but this proportion is much smaller than in Warsaw. It's much smaller in Warsaw than in Bern, and quite similar to Berlin, where also 63% of respondents reported being on social welfare. Importantly, and I think this is what we can see in that chart, women have access to much more precarious job overall than men in the situation in Warsaw. Fewer women reported regular jobs. More of them reported not earning any money, 30% versus 20% of men, or holding contracts for casual, occasional work, 15% versus 5% of men. Also, the lack of skills in the local language is the most important barrier for all respondents. But it's even more true for women, who are 69% to report that barrier compared to 49% of men. It's important to know that 8% of respondents engage in occasional work in the informal labor market, which echoes some concerns from the OECD about an important and recorded number of Ukrainians working informally or remotely in Poland. And it kind of echoes also some feedbacks that we had from case workers about the risks associated with civil law contracts in Poland, which are much more flexible and less protective than employment contracts, as there is no mandatory leave benefits, no limitation in working times. And finally, the last slide on returns and reintegration. On long-term intentions, 47% of respondents plan to return permanently to Ukraine, and 19% plan to stay in Poland permanently. This last figure is lower than in Bern and Berlin. And it's important also to know that the end of the war is the most important preconditions cited by respondents to transform that plan into action and to actually go back to Ukraine. Thank you very much. I know it was very, very dense and also a bit quick, but I'm happy to discuss any of those points if you have any question after.
I'm
properly impressed by the 30 minutes sharp for your presentation, Maxime.
Thank you.
Congratulations. This was not an easy task, but at the same time, very clear presentation. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, we are now moving to the second part of the launch, so the panel discussion. The idea is to discuss the implication of the research for practitioner, policymaker, civil society. Since the objective of MMC research really is for the research to be used by those that they need it for their work. And for that, we have today with us a number of distinguished panelists. I'm going to present them by order of their intervention. We have Claire Healy, who is the head of the UNHCR Observatory on Smuggling of Migrants, who has also participated in the research very closely. So good to have you here, Claire, with us. Then we have Elena Lassen, who is the country director for the Danish Refugee Council, which the MMC is also part of, and she's country director in Poland. And she's going to be sort of engaging with the Warsaw case study and implication for operational responses. Then we have Anastasia Scholz, who is a community outreach manager for the Swiss Red Cross in Bern. She's also a PhD researcher at University of Zurich and part of the SPIRIT project that aims to improve psychological well-being of refugees. We then have Markus Engler, who is a researcher at the DESIM Institute in Berlin, which is conducting, amongst other, research on integration of people from Ukraine in Germany. And last but not least, we have Olena Krylova, who is the director of the Ukraine Schweiz Bern in Bern, and then which is the NGO that conducted data collection for our project in Bern. So, as we can see, quite a panel. And so let's start with Claire. And then just before starting, please do add your question to the question and answer. We already have a question for Dimitri, which I took note of, and we're going to answer later. I see now a question from Benjamin. Hi, Benjamin, by the way. And then please continue to put your question. We'll either answer live, as I already did with one question from Anna. If we can write the answer in writing, otherwise we'll be pose the question to the panelists as we do for the question from Dimitri. So we start with Claire. So as Maxime presented, the incidence of smuggling amongst the 1,600 people we interview in Ukraine is very low. Is approximately 5% average, which means that 80 people out of the 1,600 we interview had to pay someone to illegally cross the border. This is how we pose the question. Now, if we compare this with, just as an example, Afghans we interviewed as NMC in Greece between 21 and 22, there, out of 943 people we interview, only one did not use smugglers, which means that the other 942 had to use one. So, in our study, we argue that the very low incidence of smuggling from Ukraine and to and within Europe strongly suggests that legal pathway that exists, which in the case of Ukrainian means the visa entry, free, which was there already before the conflict, and the temporary protection in the sort of long term had played a an incredible effective role in preventing human smuggling. Now, what do you think? What are, in your opinion, the implications for the Ukraine example for counter-smuggling operation globally? What is yours? 5 minutes.
Thank you, Roberto. It's a really important question that we have been monitoring extremely closely since the beginning of the war. And I think, you know, it's one of the findings highlighted, right, in each of the cities. Like, this is the very low incidence of smuggling. We can see it as just one finding there. In my view, it underlies all of the other findings also, including those that we are still to release on trafficking and exploitation. So coming back a bit to what Jana said at the beginning, how important all of these issues are for preventing trafficking and exploitation. So I promise I will still keep to 5 minutes, but I want to go back a little bit in time to set the context for this, because so in the early 90s in the EU and other European countries, so similar countries that are receiving the main bulk of the Ukrainians fleeing. So there was a large movement of people arriving in these countries from the former Yugoslavia, right? 92, 93, all this was being discussed. Later on, there were a large number of refugees arriving, again in the same countries, from Kosovo. And as a result of that, as a response to that, in late 2001, the European Commission adopted the Temporary Protection Directive that foresaw these kinds of situations and recognized that this happens. This is real. It's a real, you know, situation that we need to have a good response to. Then, if we fast forward, and that's how I'm going to keep into time very quickly, to 2014, 2015, 2016. Again, when we look at these same countries in the European Union and wider Europe, which are sort of quite quickly receiving increased numbers of mostly refugees, mostly people who were then subsequently granted a refugee status, such as Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, and Somalians. In this case, we had sort of exactly what was laid out in the Temporary Protection Directive. This is why, you know, why the directive was there. At that time, it wasn't activated. And what you allude to, Roberto, in the findings from, you know, the last few years among Afghans in Greece, but what, you know, I've been researching these kind of topics, I mean, specifically on migration routes for around 10 years. And, you know, it's always been the case that because there are people fleeing, there are large numbers of people coming, and there is not visa-free travel, and there is not a temporary protection mechanism activated, and there is restrictions, very, very tight restrictions on movement within the European Union also under the Dublin regulation. All of this, we could see the impact of that in the experiences of people traveling, in the experiences of people using smugglers, in the experiences of people being exploited, trafficked, abused in various different ways. So when we come to 2022, the war broke out, the invasion started on the 24th of February, and within 2 weeks, there was a Council of the European Union decision to activate the Temporary Protection Directive because it was there for exactly this reason. Back in 2015, with about 1.5 million people arriving in 1 year, it wasn't activated. In this case, it was, and has covered approximately at least over 5 million people arriving visa-free. First of all, as you said, Roberta, that was already the case. They had visa-free entry. That was absolutely crucial because they didn't need to cross irregularly as long as they had their documentation. And so there was no need for smugglers. They had rapid access to temporary protection status. They weren't spending weeks and months and years waiting for an asylum decision. They could also choose which country they wanted to go to based on, like we set out in the research, based on their existing connections, job opportunities, language skills, and so on. I would say, you know, in a quick answer to your question, that we shouldn't for a second underestimate the huge impact that this context has had. Visa-free entry, temporary protection, and free movement within the EU has not only prevented a huge amount of smuggling that would otherwise have happened, an increase in crime, an increase in vulnerability, an increase in criminal profits, but also all kinds of exploitation and abuse and trafficking that would otherwise have happened in that context, in a context where people are struggling. Not to say that there are no issues at all, and I think it's really important that we all monitor this really closely. We look at that 5% who were smuggled. We look at the evidence of exploitation and abuse that there is. But I think we can very confidently say, based on the data and research that we have, that a huge proportion of smuggling of migrants was prevented, and indeed of trafficking in persons and other forms of exploitation and abuse. And I think we need to consider that really, really carefully in terms of responses to existing and future refugee movements towards Europe.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for a bit of historical information on the temporary protection, and thanks for your closing remark. Very important, and we trust UNHCR to help having this navigating through policymakers that work on smuggling. Thank you. Thanks also for people that keep asking questions in the question answer, Benjamin, and we'll answer right after the end of the initial remark from the panelists. So, Elena from DRC, welcome. So, the briefing paper for Warsaw highlight that while respondents received quite significant assistance on arrivals, needs remain high, with cash, employment, accommodation, and healthcare cited as the most pressing one. Now, at the same time, somehow linked to this, or we want to draw a link between this and the need for assistance. In terms of movement intention in Warsaw, almost half of respondents are actually planning to return permanently to Ukraine. More or less as soon as they can, which is more than what we found, for instance, in Bern and Berlin. So, how do you see or do you assess the situation from the ground in Warsaw? Does the analysis on what I mentioned, but also what you hear earlier from Maxime, correspond to your assessment situation, and what are the implications of what you heard today, if you agree, for the humanitarian responses? All easy questions, so you have 5 minutes to answer.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you to the UMC team and the partners who have been publishing and working on this very timely and informative case study that confirms a lot of the anecdotal feedback that we receive from our partners, from refugees, from displaced communities, as well as from other similar studies that have also been published here in Poland. It also informs us very well and positions us very well for the future programming and interventions that we are working on. So, I mean, what we have really seen in terms of the context of Poland, I mean, based also on what Claire has been mentioning earlier on, is an incredible solidarity with the displaced communities across all segments of the society. So that's not only provision in terms of the legal frameworks and access to social services that were provided, but also from the civil society. I think that has been really an extraordinary effort that shouldn't be neglected in terms of the initial response. But as documented, I mean, in the case study and from our experience as well, many needs are unmet, and then they're not being addressed, and we need to keep a very, very close eye on that. We are talking about close to 1 million people being registered for the temporary protection here in Poland. Out of that, close to 110,000 in Warsaw only. So just very, very briefly on DRC, which has been in Poland since March 2022. And really want to highlight here that we work closely with national partners, so just bringing in this element of the very vibrant social sector here in country across many locations where we provide inclusive protection services through community centers and the mobile outreach activities. In Warsaw specifically, we collaborate with Polish Migration Forum and Foundation for Freedom, if any of them are joining our call also today. These are really the organizations that are providing protection services such as identification of persons at risk, counseling, casework, referrals, mental health, individual protection assistance, access to legal aid services, child protection activities, and so forth, and have managed since only in the past 6 months to provide those services to over 8,600 individuals. So I just want to share a little bit of couple of consolidated reflections that maybe are going to further hopefully inform the data that has been shared, but maybe give also some ideas or trends that we are seeing, how the findings from this and similar studies might be impacting our future work as well. I think there is some particularities when it comes to the context in Poland, because of the sort of the supportive legal environment and the temporary protection that has been availed, and the proximity with Ukraine. We see really a high level of pendulum movements also to and from countries. In some figure shows up that up to 20,000 individuals are crossing the borders daily for shorter term periods and then are returning. We have also seen in the study that has been published by MMC and partners that there isn't necessarily a direct correlation between feeling safe and accepted in Poland and the wish to return. So there is a quite strong sort of underlining that there needs to be a safe environment in Ukraine before there will be a possibility for return. But we certainly see that maybe this opportunity for pendulum movements is also giving a bit more positive hopes that individuals would like to return in the longer run. As mentioned also and highlighted in the survey also, needs remain big, and there are several reasons that are playing into that. One of them is that there are changes also in terms of the support and services that refugees are having access to. There is diminishing access to emergency aid, so cash programming that has really been a core component of the response is really sort of winding off. There has been changes also introduced in terms of the access to some of the basic services such as accommodation, where refugees now are also required to pay partially for some of those recommendations as well. And then an important element also that majority of the displaced are in fact living in the private accommodation, which means that our access and our assessment or ability to assess their direct needs might be a bit more challenging than in some of other contexts where you might have huge numbers in collective centers, in shelters, and therefore an easier access as well. I would say the third very, very important element to highlight a bit of perspective on the findings and also the implications for our future work is what has been very nicely framed also as compassion fatigue. And we can describe those in two different levels. We can see slowly that within the host communities, I mean, there is still a lot of support for the displaced communities, but could slowly start to see the trends also that there is perhaps a fatigue also in terms of continuous support for the displaced communities, and the social cohesion focus will really be key in the coming periods. That coupled up with the upcoming elections in October is something that we will need to keep an eye on. In terms of the fatigue and the support for it, we not only see that in terms from the host communities themselves, but from the international community as well. We see that much of the support that has been sort of availed to the civil society sector that has been providing the direct services and access to services to displaced communities is really being diminished in 2023, and we are expecting even a further decrease in funding available for the organizations that are providing support to the displaced communities, and that we think might have a negative impact in terms of how we can address the needs of the displaced communities. So while there is a lot of sort of celebration and really kudos that needs to be given to the international community in terms of availing the temporary protection to the displaced community, that shouldn't at the same time be a pathway towards complacency and sort of ignoring the critical needs as they are also highlighted in the report. So that will be very briefly from my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think I've been very effective in scaring people off about speaking longer than their 5 minutes, which is good. So thank you very much, and thank you for your reflection, for your sort of view from the ground. There are some additional questions for you coming from the audience, which we're going to pose you later, but thank you for now. Now we move to Anastasia. So in Bern, as I mentioned earlier, you work as community outreacher, which means that you are in direct and daily contact with people in Ukraine, where you are coming from as well. So simple question, but I think an important one for you. Do the finding of the report for Bern, and perhaps also from the others, if you are familiar with other contexts, which might be the case, reflect the reality you're witnessing during your daily interaction? When we actually had a chat a bit earlier this week, you made some interesting point about use of social media and return intention linked to your work. So would you like to share perhaps some of those reflections? Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you very much for your introduction. And yes, I work as the community outreach manager in Helpful Project. It's the informational website with the integrated Telegram channel for people fleeing from Ukraine. And I would like to relate to a few findings, as you have mentioned. So one of them is that people fleeing from Ukraine usually use Telegram as the primary source of information they're looking for. It was shown on page 16 of the report, where you could see Telegram and social media on the first position, and on the third position, websites. So that is why we also share important information on these sources, and that is why we also use these sources for our needs analysis for the community. This is also the reason why we communicate with the community through Telegram, because people from Ukraine can actually write their inquiries in our Telegram channel. And we used to have volunteers that were working on this question, and now we're working on them themselves. And this is an interesting thing. And also people from Ukraine, they use Telegram for socializing purposes. Like it's a very strong medium to gather people around and for the information exchange. And the second finding I would like to refer is the intention to go back to Ukraine. We get actually a lot of inquiries and questions regarding the assistance that that NGOs can provide in order so that people can go back to Ukraine. And so why is actually this happening is that a lot of people cannot integrate here in the new environment. And the main reason for that is actually lack of adaptivity skills, psychological traumas, of course, and the language barrier was the main factor that contributes to this phenomena. So also people feel social isolation, and they actually thinking about going back to Ukraine, despite of the findings that you have mentioned before, that one of the reasons that they left Ukraine was the fear of physical threat and death. And because they cannot find the way they can integrate themselves here in a new environment, so then they choose to actually go back to danger and not to try to find how to integrate themselves here. That's why I wanted to keep it super short. And if someone has more questions, community-related questions, I would like to answer them. So yes, these are the two relations to the key findings that I found interesting from our perspective.
Thank you, Anastasia. Indeed, very interesting. I think that you are making a point about the consequences of a crisis that is becoming protracted. Indeed, as we mentioned at the beginning, on return intention, which is somehow also point a bit of a limitation of the kind of exercise we are conducting, where we ask people that are still in Bern whether they intend to return. We are, of course, not interviewing people who return already. And we know that if there is one data that is really a bit missing from the picture, is the data about people that return to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And now this is a second time we hear something about protracted crisis. Also, you, Elena, mentioned something about the consequences on a crisis that is becoming protracted, on the access that people have to assistance, but also potentially on the solidarity. So all very important point. Thank you. Now, I need to resist the temptation of asking follow-up question and keep going, and noting a follow-up question for later. And we move to Marcus from the DESIM Institute in Berlin. So, as I said when I introduced you, the DESIM Center has been conducting, amongst other, research on integration of people from Ukraine in Berlin. Now the question is, as the conflict continues, and with 38% of Ukrainians in Berlin actually planning to stay in Germany permanently, so we move away from return and we look at the intention to stay actually. How do you assess the sort of policy challenges and good practices to support and integrate refugees from Ukraine in Bern on the long term? Have you noticed an inflection in refugee policy in Berlin since the outbreak of the conflict? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberto, and I mean, also to Maxime for reaching out. You really have to interrupt me, right? Because the question you just asked is not an easy one.
You can me for that in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I do my best, but you know, since I have to improvise a little bit, what I'm going to say. I mean, first of all, it's true we at DESIM Institute, we are conducting a number of research projects, also with the international partners on, I mean, all kinds of, you know, migration policy or integration policy relevant topics, but we also have specific projects on the Ukrainian situation. I mean, Maxime presented a lot of numbers and data in a very short time. I didn't have the time really to connect, you know, in detail to what we did to compare. But I mean, I also talked to a few colleagues before. I think, of course, there will be differences in details, but the overall picture is more or less similar. You know, when I read the Berlin paper, I had the feeling, okay, yeah, there's nothing new really for me in there. Which, you know, nothing really surprising, shocking, or where I thought that's totally not what I would have expected. So it seems to confirm also, you know, what we are finding, but it would be, I guess, very relevant to discuss more in detail, you know, where we find differences maybe, also between the countries. Also, I mean, you know, of course, there's the research perspective, but I've also been talking briefly with, you know, policymakers and people from Berlin administration. And I mean, you know, from a city perspective, and it's also from a country perspective, it's true, we cannot only focus on Ukrainians, right? It's really, I mean, there are refugees and migrants from, you know, really all kinds of countries. And if we take the city of Berlin, I mean, you know, the population of the city has been increasing about almost 500,000 in 10 years. And it's almost, you know, completely migration related, international migration. And of course, there's some specific rules, as we all know, for Ukrainians. And I mean, the city of Berlin, I mean, of course, started by using all the mechanisms and you know, procedures in place, and you know, added more funding and gave a little more flexibility here and there. I mean, you really have to see it's a huge challenge, you know, for every city. I mean, we're talking about 60,000 you know, Ukrainian refugees in the city of Berlin, or even more. And Berlin also was a hub, like for Germany, right? So several hundred thousands of Ukrainians actually transited by Berlin, right? In parallel, we have also an increase of migrants and refugees from other countries, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, also arriving in this city. So just this morning, I was in a meeting with people from Berlin administration and NGOs, and it's really, the picture is really, okay, we managed to do it, everybody was showed great solidarity and so on. But now we are really at the moment where we also see huge challenges. Probably in our data, we didn't find, this kind of compassion fatigue, very clearly in the population and civil society. I mean, at least not for Ukrainians. The debate in Germany is very polarized at the policy level, also media level. So there are Ukrainians here, and probably people would be ready to host another million of Ukrainians. But all the other migrants and refugees, they should stay in other countries. That's really what we are observing. It's of course highly problematic, right, at different levels. But that's what's happening. But I mean, all in all, the kind of great efforts have been made. But the reception kind of system of the city of Berlin, which means administration, but also NGOs and so on, is really under a lot of stress and probably very close to being dysfunctional. I have to say, we are also, coming out of a series of multiple crises, as you all know, COVID, inflation. It means public budgets. We've been cuts. We've seen dramatic cuts announced at different levels. So I'm really concerned about how this will continue at different levels. I mean, we could talk about schools, but also about, of course, NGOs or kind of the foreigners administration. And of course, we also see increasing, as I said, hostility, but not, I mean, so much against Ukrainians, more against, other migrants. And I mean, maybe a little anecdote I'd like to share, right? Because Berlin has been through this in 2015-16 also. I mean, almost breakdown of the reception system and so on. And of course, based on this experience, the administration said we cannot let this happen again. Complete breakdown of public administration. So they adopted something, very almost spectacular for a German context. They adopted a very pragmatic and, digitalized approach for newly arriving Ukrainian refugees, which was first adopted in Berlin. The other parts of Germany have been super skeptical, but then they also adopted it, meaning you could auto-register, just with your Ukrainian passport. On a website, you could say, I'm a Ukrainian refugee in Berlin. I'm here now. You enter your number. And then immediately you would get a PDF document, on your smartphone saying that you are now registered and you can work from this day on. This was a huge change of attitude, right? Mm-hmm. And I think those changes happened at many levels, and that's something we, also as researchers but also practitioners, we really have to analyze and to see what we can learn from it to adapt it into more broadly. It's often, we often have this debate about, this being a blueprint for other situations, and I think it still is. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm almost reaching my 5 minutes, Roberto.
I think you just did. So if we can perhaps close it here.
Absolutely.
But thank you, and I think it's very interesting. I mean, in migration studies, we always say that it will be very important to learn out of the different crises that we have been facing, instead of moving from one crisis to the other with very little learning. And we have been saying this with regard to the impact that legal pathways has had on smuggling. Now I'm hearing also that they are learning also in the way reception has been organized. So yeah, we can only hope that indeed those lessons learned will be applied sometime as well. As a researcher, we can only take note of those lessons learned and contribute to give them visibility, which is what we are doing. We'll continue doing. But thank you. I think, yeah, also interesting. I heard the presenter, we cannot focus on Ukrainians. but then we did actually focus on Ukrainian Europe collectively, meaning that a different treatment was applied to Ukrainians compared to that has been applied to others. And then, as you also said, the risk is even that the influx of Ukrainian paradoxically will not have an impact on more Ukrainians coming, but will have an impact on others, because there is a fatigue over influx of refugees, which is going to be having an impact on those that are perceived as being less sort of welcome or in need, which are people not coming from Ukraine. So all very, very interesting point, and which could probably speak about for hours, but we don't do that. Instead, we give the floor to the panelist that has been patiently waiting all along, which is Olena. Thank you. As I said, Olena is director of an NGO who she created at the outset of the crisis in Bern. And then, you know, other than that, we have been 20 years in the career of international development as a consultant working on governance issues in Ukraine and the region. Yeah, following the crisis in 22 February, you decided to support establishing this NGO that has the aim of facilitating the integration of Ukrainian refugees in Bern and to support broadly exchange between Switzerland and Ukraine, also by virtue of having been living in Switzerland for a long time. So, as I said, your NGO carried out the data collection for our project in Bern, where we interviewed 600 Ukrainians. So the question to you is, if you can tell us how the research findings go along with your experience as Ukrainian in Bern, working with and for other Ukrainians, and the observation coming from these the key challenges that people from Ukraine are experiencing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this research. Our organization has extremely interesting experience, and the opportunity for me to speak today. I will try to be very brief. I mean, indeed, this research confirmed quite a number of trends we've been observing. You just mentioned the return recently, and that, of course, through research, we were not able to capture figures and trends on a return, but in Switzerland, in Bern in particular, we see a small wave of people coming back, especially to the regions that are more or less stable and where recovery is started already. But also, I think we'll be seeing more of these during this summer because of the school year. And as association, we have several concerns, and I will talk here more about integration and vulnerabilities, return-related issues rather than trafficking and exploitation. As you pointed out, the situation in Bern is pretty good in that sense, also compared to other places that were researched. But things that we have been observed and things that we think deserve to go into the dialogue and policy advocacy at the cantonal, but also the community level, because Switzerland is a very decentralized or never centralized country, I would rather say. So we have different policies and different approaches, methods that are applied to managing the refugees, Ukrainian refugees issues. So there's issues related to economic integration. We've seen from the research that 11% people are employed. This confirms the official statistics. I think it's about 12 in Bern officially, and about 30%, more than 30% of people report that they intend to stay. Even if we assume that some invest still in learning German, some young people still focus on their studies, I mean, there's still a gap which deserves attention. And then from experience, we know, for instance, that quite a number of people would be interested to start their own businesses or become self-employed, but the procedures are not adjusted to self-employment of refugees with status S or refugees generally, from enrolling to the system, to the tax declarations. And social workers are confusing or confuse themselves, sometimes paradoxically, and they are not encouraging refugees to enter the system. There's also a share of people who are benefiting from the social assistance packages, but still have income back in Ukraine. and quite a number of them intend to stay, and their legalization beyond status S will be quite problematic. That's maybe on the economic side, a couple of issues. On the social and cultural integration side, we see that among those people who are not integrated into the labor market and young people who are not integrated into the educational, vocational training, there are limited opportunities to interface with Swiss communities and Swiss system. As a result, many Ukrainians restrain themselves to communicating among Ukrainians and also using a lot social media, from where they source information and very often not very objective and correct. We also have seen through the social and psychological support that our NGO is providing that this, can really lead women to emotional exclusion, instability, and even alcoholism in some cases, and young people to antisocial behavior and isolation. Then there is a special category of men who left illegally Ukraine. We will not discuss the reasons here, and they would definitely have difficulties going back. So the issue of their integration, reintegration is not really being discussed. So, all these issues, I just pointed some, we think require closer look. We were able to capture them through this research, but we observe trends and we observe a need for dialogue with the system, for policy solutions that our NGOs is trying to pursue, what is, of course, very challenging in a decentralized setting like Switzerland. But we really hope that they deserve attention and they come on the table of people who take decisions in the coming future.
Thanks. So, thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting, and always useful to have this kind of reflection from a proper frontline respondent like you. Now, we have 4 questions and 3 minutes, which seems a bit of a challenge. But let's start at least, and we'll start with you, Olena, if you don't mind. I will really ask you to try to answer in 30 seconds, just so that we can answer to as many questions as possible. So the first question was from Dimitrio, and then is asking how difficult it was to approach and identify a respondent in Bern and Berlin. So perhaps for Bern, can you tell us literally in 30 seconds what has been the experience in reaching out to people to be interviewed for the study, Olena?
We didn't have difficulties, although we anticipated some. Even from the beginning, we had quite high self-enrollment rate. We advertised through social media also, but also in the places where people come to register or socialize. And we had something like 15 or 18% of self-enrollment. And then to balance it also to make sure that we are visiting different locations, people with different socioeconomic situations, etc. So we tried to reach out to where they live, and then where people spend time hanging around, waiting in the queue for their social assistance issues to be clarified or for registration, etc. And in that sense, I think we were quite quickly to 600 questionnaires.
Okay, thank you. So difficult, but not impossible, indeed. Thanks. Now we have another question, which I think is perhaps for Maxime. Is from Benjamin, as he's asking if we noted socioeconomic differences of Ukrainian and third country national across your study site, and the impact that this might have had on having or not having a social network in the respective cities. Maxime.
Sure. So yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think we need to keep in mind that among third country nationals and among Ukrainians as well, there is a huge diversity of profiles in terms of socioeconomic background. If we look at Warsaw, for instance, we interviewed mostly Belarusians that were mostly working in the IT sector and were quite highly qualified, so had quite good jobs already, and the result of that, they were much better off in terms of livelihoods, and they had much less needs than Ukrainians. But I think it's also because they're coming from this specific background, where we know historically Belarusians have been invited, Belarusians working in IT sector have been invited to work in Ukraine in the past. So that's one thing. And what was suggested, the fact that social network has an impact, is also very true. If you look at the report, you will see that most of them, more Belarusians than Ukrainians, reported friends and compatriots in Warsaw as a reason to come. On the other side, if you look at the third country nationals that we interviewed in Berlin, who are much more diverse groups, mostly people from Asia and Africa, the situation is much more different, and they are much more vulnerable than Ukrainians, because most of them were students, most of them don't come from a very educated background, or struggle to have access to a status and a stable situation in Berlin.
Thank you. So it's past 4, but I see that people are still on, most of the participants. So I'll dare to take a couple of extra minutes to ask the last question to Elena for Warsaw, and then we'll close afterwards. So there is a question, I think, still from Dimitrio. When it comes to Warsaw, how would experts, which is you, Elena, assess the situation with regard to condition of Ukrainian refugees in temporary shelter?
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Dimitri, for question. Dimitri, a very short answer would be that I would not know specifically when it comes to temporary to the shelters, because that's not the area that we work in specifically in Warsaw. I can also add to that one of the reasons for that is as well that many Ukrainians are residing in rental private accommodations. And we'll also add to that in other areas across Poland, we have seen somehow differences between different nationality groups when it comes to displacement from Ukraine. So we have seen that Roma communities in particular are extremely vulnerable. Their shelters are certainly not up to a standard. That will be very, very brief.
Yeah, thank you. So we had another question from Anna, but I think that Anastasia, you've been answering live. Is 2 minutes past, and then some of the panelists will have to leave. So I prefer to close. We will put the address. If you have any question on top of what we managed to answer today, you can always send it to us, to the Mixed Migration Center Europe. We'll try to answer. And so I'd like to close by thanking really the panelists for their very, very interesting insight, and Maxime for the presentation, and then of course Jana as a representative of the donors, and Claire as a representative for UNHCR with whom we collaborated. Thank you all. Thanks for the people that attended, and see you next launch. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.